The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. All the fears I ever had never measured up to the fears that grew in me after becoming a parent. Before, my fears were for me or for the people I loved, but never anyone who was dependent on me. My folks never mentioned this newfound terror that comes with parenthood, this vulnerability, and I wasn't prepared. And perhaps your parents never told you, nor did it always seem evident, but I can just about guarantee that loving you is likely the best and most terrifying thing they have ever done. Because when you become a parent, when you decide in all your brokenness and messed up selfishness that suddenly this person means more to you than you mean to yourself, the world changes and everything is absolutely out of control. I can't begin to imagine what it must be like for God to love us. God, our parent, our source of life and creator. I can't imagine how much God worries for us. How deep that love must go that the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and end, would put up with all that we must put God through. And yet God does. There's no situation, no screw up, no fear great enough that God would turn from us. Because God decided long ago that he would love his creation, us, more than he loves himself. I mean, think about every stupid, reckless, impossible thing that you have ever done. I'll give you a minute. Now multiply that by billions, representing all the people throughout all time, and yet none of those fears that we put God through keep her from loving us. The vulnerability and courage it must have taken for God to choose to not only be the fearful, loving parent, but also the hopeful, fragile child is astounding. When we talk about the miracle of Christmas, this is it. It's everything. Fear, hope, uncertainty, reckless abandon, all of it for you, for love. And this is a birth that should not have been. It was a pregnancy that defied expectations, a journey taken against better judgment, a delivery that almost had no place or space, a king that defied the very idea of what a king is, red-faced and crying in a feeding trough. Yet within the vulnerability of that smallness, he somehow has the supreme power to turn the world upside down. You know, it could have been different. Jesus could have been born to a more prestigious family, maybe someone with a little money, connections. His mother and father could have been married. Then she would have given birth surrounded by the women in her family rather than shunned. They could have had a family who had an in with Herod. No fleeing for their lives, no living as refugees, no sneaking back into their country of birth. They could have, but God didn't. Because God knew that in this child there would be hope for every outcast. God knew that in this child there would be peace for those who mourn. God knew that in this child there would be a new way to live and love. And in order for that to happen, Jesus had to be for all. And how do you encompass all? You start from the edges. Because God knew you. God knew that as much as you tried to keep it together, you would need a Savior who understood your chaos, who lived through it, the struggle you feel, the loneliness that threatens to consume, the pain of watching those you love self-destruct, the hopes that are dashed, the fears and anxieties that rule your waking hours, the loss, again and again and again, that loss that is as much a part of being a fragile human as breathing. God knew you. And God knows you still, all of you, because God has walked your path. God has experienced the vulnerability of this flesh and bones life. God knows, not in some academic way, but in the messy, embodied, tear-stained, laugh out loud, foot in mouth, fear-filled yearning that can only be found in the unsettled squall of human experience. And I'll let you in on a secret. Sometimes that is what terrifies me. I don't know if I want to be known so deeply. I spend too much time covering up the fears and anxieties, the less than adequate parts of myself for God to pull back the veil and see all of me. And I expect I'm not the only one. Yet in the same breath, how incredible it is to be wholly known and still wholly loved. It changes the game. I mean, suddenly there's a strength, a relationship and power that cannot be forfeit. It is ours because it is God's, and God freely gives. And in that freely given love, embodied on that not-so-silent night, we're free to live with vulnerability just as Jesus taught us, just as God desires for us. How many times do we allow fear to hold us back from trying, from loving, from embodying God? How often does fear of rejection keep us from reaching out, or fear of the unknown keep us from stepping beyond our comfort zone and entering uncharted territory? How often does fear keep us from pursuing God's dream, God's justice? Courage is not being without fear, because to live without fear would be to live without love. Rather, courage is having fear and loving anyway. It's facing fear and knowing that what you stand for is far greater than failing. It is recognizing that the joy of trying will always outweigh the pain of failure. Despite the fact that it is a certainty that we will cause God heartbreak, God still lays it all out there. There's no holding back. Love is still freely given. God still pours herself out into creation, into us. When we surrender our fears to God, it is more than being fearless. Rather, when we surrender our fears to God, it is a matter of trusting that God will be big enough to see us through despite the fears that plague us. And when we live in such a way of vulnerability, a way of trusting that the small things are actually, in fact, the large things, are the God things, Jesus is born again and again and again into our world. Because you see, hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight.